Hi, everybody. This is Arlo Gilbert, co-founder and CEO of Osano, a leading data privacy management platform. And you are listening to the Privacy Insider Podcast. This show explores the past, present, and future of data privacy for privacy and business leaders alike, as well as anyone who wants to keep privacy top of mind. All right, welcome to episode 2 of the Privacy Insider Podcast. I'm Arlo Gilbert, your host. I am the CEO and co-founder at Osano, a leading data privacy company. And today we're going to be welcoming Katharine Tomko in part 2 of our podcast with her. If you didn't listen to part 1, I would highly recommend that you go check that out first. There are some great stories about her personal experiences that led her into privacy. The military was involved and governments. And anyways, go tune in and subscribe if you like it. So today we're going to be talking with Katharine about the big challenges in data privacy that are coming up around AI and how that AI growth has impacted data privacy and how people are thinking about that. Welcome, Katharine. It's so nice to see you again and so delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you. So happy to be here for part 2.
Yeah. And for those of you who didn't listen to episode 1 and you like to read the end of the book first, Katharine was the first privacy lead at Facebook a long time ago. She built their privacy programs in response to FTC orders. Her family has an amazing history of data privacy, and she is now an investor at First Ascent Ventures, where she leads investments in B2B software companies. She is an investor in Osano and has been a wonderful board member that I'm just so happy to call a friend now. All right, so Katharine, let's kind of pick up where we left off. I mean, when we finished our last episode, we talked a lot about privacy as a human right. We talked about government possession of data and how that can become a problem. So today I thought we might just kind of think about the future. We talked a lot about the past on the last episode. So as you've seen privacy evolve and change over close to decades now. So I'm really curious. So when you think, if you got out your crystal ball and you're thinking about predictions for the future, what do you see coming around the corner that privacy pros and business people and startups should be thinking about?
Yes. So I think I have like the good witch crystal ball and like the bad witch crystal ball. And I think we're very much at this pivotal fork in the road with sort of the uptick in the usage of AI and large language models and generative AI, transformative AI, quantum computing. So I think like you think about the amount of data that has been amassed over the last 20 years or so. Now you take all of this data and you add a layer of AI, predictive AI, et cetera. Now we could potentially go down a path of creating like a really cool society. Like there's a lot of like AI use cases that sound really fantastic that would really make our lives better. We also could go down the path of a complete dystopian society. Like I really like when people say, hey, we're at this like inflection point of this potential existential crises. I really do believe that. I really do. And I think in the last episode, we talked a little bit about my family history and the innocuous, innocent pieces of information that were just misconstrued. So you take that, you take all of your Amazon purchases combined with what Alexa might be picking up on what you and your family are saying, combined with your Facebook posts. Now, you could create predictive models that say, hey, Katharine is a potential threat to society. Easily could do that. Or you could create predictive models saying, hey, Katharine, we actually know what you'd like to purchase next time. I don't know the direction we are going. I think it really is very much dependent on how much people understand privacy and the implications. I think Osano is potentially going to do great things for companies with respect to getting their data practice ducks in a row such that we can have more control as end users with respect to where our data ultimately goes and how it's used.
So it sounds to me, from what you're saying, that the good crystal ball and the bad crystal ball, the good witch and the bad witch, both see a future where AI is a big piece of our society, and we're hoping that we're going to go in the positive direction. I'm really curious, when you think about AI, and for those in the audience who are not technologists, or maybe you're not super familiar with how AI works, one of the really interesting challenges around AI is that a lot of these models are black boxes. So I have something, I feed the quarter in and it spits out a guinea pig. I feed the quarter in and it spits out a picture of Vincent van Gogh. And as the developer of that model, I don't have any way of going through and saying, here's how it arrived at that decision. I can follow its logic branch. So you really put stuff in, and then you hope the model does everything that it's supposed to do, and you look at the output. But the challenge there is not knowing exactly what data it used to make its decisions. And so as we think about, the regulations, and we think about business challenges around AI, I'm curious if there are any thoughts you have about what companies should be doing around AI, and if there are any big risks that they have that they need to be considering while they're building out their AI strategy.
Yeah, I think with respect to the large language models like OpenAI or Llama, where you describe them as like these black boxes in the sense of the internet was kind of scraped with respect to sort of feeding these models. And we really have no idea why ChatGPT gives you the answer to the question that you ask. So for that, I don't know. I have watched a few videos on how they built Gen AI models, and oh my gosh, so it's complicated. So with respect to the large language models that I know companies want to leverage to add their own data to it, that is risky in my opinion. Because while you may be able to have control over your own data, you really have no idea what OpenAI did with respect to creating that large language model. So I have seen that there are companies coming out that are attempting to build large language models, really understanding the data that is in the model, really understanding permissions, consent, really anonymizing the data. So I have seen a couple of companies that are saying, okay, we understand the risk of these large language models, potential hallucinations, etc. Let's take a new approach of actually building these LLMs privacy first. Now, who knows which direction I'm hopeful about them. But in terms of recommendations for companies, you really need to understand the data that you have. You have to understand data sources. You need to understand where the data is coming, what lawful basis you have to process the data. Can you feed the data into a model, for example? Do you have permission to? Also do risk assessments on these models. Think through what are the potential use cases, both good and bad, of these models. It was similar to when I was at Facebook and we would sit in conference rooms and be like, okay, if you wanted to launder money on our platform, how could you do it? And we came up with ways and then figured out the controls to mitigate individuals laundering money with farm cash. So I really recommend companies get control of their data. It's no longer a, hey, you might get fined if you don't, or hey, you might have a data breach if you don't. This is a potential existential risk to society if they do not.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. You mentioned something that, if you're a privacy pro, you probably heard some of those key phrases, but if you're a business person or you're just a lay person learning about privacy today, you talked about consent. And one of the interesting things about consent is that it's supposed to be for a specific purpose. So I want to hear your personal take on how does that work if I'm taking data that you gave to me and I'm using it to train a model that trades stocks? And you never said that was okay. How does that work?
I think this is going to be the big challenge, is from a privacy perspective and sort of taking the existing privacy frameworks, laws, and regulations. I have yet to see how that actually applies to AI models. You're absolutely right. When you give consent to an organization to use your data, they are supposed to tell you the specific cases that your data is going to be used for. If your data is fed into these models, the potential use cases are who knows how many. So I don't understand. I have yet to understand how you actually could give consent to have your data used, unless you're hey, no big deal. You can take my data, and I understand that it might be used for a million different things. But I don't know any individual who is thoughtful about the risks around this saying, yes, this is great. From my perspective, don't put personally identifiable information into models. That being said, I am not a software engineer and I am not a data scientist. So in terms of building and deploying models, I don't understand if leveraging PII is critical. Based on those that I've spoken to, a lot of them are you don't really need to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's positive. And then we were at, or I guess you weren't there, but I went and attended the IAPP AI conference that they held in Boston maybe 4 months ago, something like that. And I sat through a panel listening to an expert who'd been in touch with the FTC. And the FTC has basically said that if you go use personal data in your model training process, and it turns out that you either didn't have consent or that personal data is being exfiltrated and leaked because of it, or there's some sort of risk, the only viable solution for these models is, forgive me, I'm in Texas, so sometimes we talk like this, but you got to take that model out in the backyard and shoot it in the head and start over because there is no way to go remove a couple pieces of data from a model. And training those things is super expensive. So that's a pretty big risk that, you could invest millions of dollars, have to go out and destroy all of your work and start from scratch if you weren't careful. I thought that was really interesting. And I certainly hope that businesses take that to heart as they're taking their first steps into AI.
I talk a lot about what you just model disgorgement or algorithmic disgorgement, because it is in fact an enforcement action that the Federal Trade Commission is using. This is not them coming out and saying, hey, we might consider doing this. They have done this. They did it with Weight Watchers, and they will continue to do this. And you're absolutely right. Creating complex models where you need to feed a lot of data is in the millions of dollars. So this is where I think investors in venture capital actually can sort of, in their diligence process, do a little bit of extra checking with respect to, hey, if you are leveraging data in models, talk to us about how you're thinking through this. Because the worst thing that could happen is you invest in a company that gets hit with algorithmic disgorgement, unless you are a very large company that can afford to lose millions of dollars worth of models, your company will be done for.
Yeah. And then you take that to the far extreme. You think about, companies like Anthropic and companies like OpenAI who've developed ChatGPT. I mean, they've spent billions of dollars building their models. And, we keep hearing rumblings that there is personal data in ChatGPT. And there's been plenty of times where information about people popped out of it. And I know that the New York Times filed suit against OpenAI, and that was really focused on copyright. But I feel like that's the beginning. I think we may see some really interesting fallout from that problem and from the disgorgement issue. And then I have to ask, because it's been in the news lately, have you paid attention to the AI Act at all? Do you think it's going to have an impact? Are you excited about it? Tell me about your thoughts on the AI Act out of Europe.
I haven't spent a ton of time looking at it because it's going to be another 2 years before anything happens with respect. I have high level sort of looked at like what the main components are with respect to high risk models that affect like critical infra, et cetera. I have to say, while I think regulation is a decent enough stick to get companies to think about things, practically, regulations are very challenging to sort of internalize and impose on companies. So I much prefer taking the more privacy advocacy role of really getting companies to internalize and build out a culture of ethics and a culture of compliance and a culture of privacy, because ultimately, all of these laws and regulations, they just are kind of pushing companies to do right by individuals, right by society, right by customers, et cetera. So you can build a culture that ultimately does that without this hammer of regulations. And I also feel like regulations are always lagging. Like in 2 years, who knows where we will be at?
2 years ago, we didn't even have the technology that is the foundation for so many of these models, transformers. It always strikes me as a little overly ambitious when I see regulators trying to pass regulations when a technology is in its infancy. I mean, privacy regulations, we finally saw GDPR come to life, but the internet had been around for decades. And so, we had plenty of time to evaluate how data worked and how it flowed. And nobody knows what it's going to be like in 2 years yet.
Yeah, and I also feel like I've been seeing a lot about software engineers or data scientists or whoever is responsible for these models are going to have to be able to explain them, the explainability of models. And when I ask data scientists and software engineers, hey, like, what does explainability mean? They're like, well, with complex neural networks, how do you do that? So I kind of wonder, like, do the regulators know? Like, could the regulators take a model that leverages like OpenAI and then sort of tunes with additional data? Like, could they explain that model? I don't know. I've asked this question to people way smarter than me, and nobody seems to have an answer.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And yeah, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts, even though you haven't spent a lot of time in the AI Act looking at it. So let's shift gears. I think, we promised some practical advice, and, given that you invest in B2B startups, I would love to understand, what advice would you have for startups? Because they don't have deep pockets and the kinds of budgets and personnel that are in place. We'd love to understand, what you would suggest to them as they're trying to navigate data privacy.
To be honest, like, I actually think this is not like a plug for your book, although it is a plug for your book in a way. Like the Privacy Insider is a very practical guide for people who have not necessarily spent their career working in privacy to say, okay, this is like kind of the history of privacy. This is why it really matters. These are the risks. And these are like the things that you should think about when you're building a privacy program. I read it recently, and even for myself who spent almost 20 years in privacy, it was like, oh, this is actually like super helpful. I wish I had this when I built Facebook's privacy program. So I also really think that we encourage our companies to actually spend money on privacy. Like, I understand startups do not have the budgets of these large companies that can hire 1,000 people to tackle privacy issues, but you need to hire someone and you need to bring in software to help automate a lot of the manual tasks. And there is great software out there right now. Osano, for example, like that really helps automate a lot of like manual tasks around subject access requests, really helps with like the cookie consent aspect, etc. I also would recommend doing a risk assessment. I think that is absolutely a critical first step for understanding what are your risks, what do you care about, prioritize how to mitigate those risks. This is not something, hey, hire a privacy expert and have them do the risk assessment. No, like the C-suite and executive team needs to be involved in this. They need to internalize what is going on. They need to understand data flows. They need to understand what people at your company are worried about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I appreciate the shout out for Osana, but I think you're absolutely right. You know, go pick up some software that purports to help you with rights management and cookie pop-ups and assessments. These are kind of the basic fundamental pieces of building your privacy platform for your website and for your applications. I love the feedback about the assessments. Do you have any suggestions on what they should be thinking about when they're doing those assessments? Do they go download an assessment off the web? Is there an assessment you like? How do you think they would go about starting that process?
There's lots available online to just kind of help you with the start of an assessment. I sort of created one years and years ago that I still leverage around where we split it up into, think about data, for example. Now, figure out, where is your data coming from? Where does your data go? Where does your data reside? What jurisdictions does your data reside in? Okay, now that you understand that, you can start understanding which laws and regulations within which jurisdictions do you need to comply with. Now look at like sort of back-end infra. Look at your code development process. Think about change management. Think about your people. Like often your biggest risk is not necessarily within your product. Often your biggest risk is your people with respect to sharing like unencrypted emails with lists of customer data, just emailing it who knows where, or saving files on laptops and then leaving the laptops in their car, which get broken into. And like really also like understanding, how do you train your people? Like, how do you create a culture where people feel comfortable bringing risks to the table? Like, I sat in so many postmortems from various breaches, and there was never one where an individual was sitting there going, thought this might happen. Like every single one, there was one person that's like, yeah, I saw this happening. Why didn't you say anything?
It sounds like a lot of work, right? And so you talked about this idea of figuring out what regulations you're covered by and then going and making sure that you follow those regulations. But one of the challenges we've seen in the privacy space is that regulations are coming out so fast, and opinions from DPAs like Keneal and the ICO. I mean, these keep changing they kind of move the goalposts a little bit. And that's why, at Osana, one of the things that we've talked a lot about, and it sounds like hokey marketing, is just try to do the right thing, right? And then follow those kindergarten principles of, ask permission, be honest, and if somebody wants something back, give it back to them. Our view, and my personal view, is that if you go out and do those things, you are probably doing better than most companies out there by just even spending the time thinking about it. And don't try and go read the regulations. Talk to somebody who knows the regulations because they're long, they're complicated, they're made for lawyers to read. I'm curious because we have seen over the past decade a shift in, like, for example, insurers now offer cybersecurity policies, right? And 20 years ago, they didn't know what cybersecurity meant. I'm wondering, do you think that we're going to be going in a direction where there'll be commercial pressure to build privacy programs?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Like we are already seeing that. Companies that have more risky data practices, it is becoming more and more challenging for them to get cyber insurance. I think Marsh actually came out with a really interesting report on this, and they actually highlighted the various jurisdictions and the risks that made them more and more concerned about insuring. And then you think about, well, given the uptick in ransomware attacks, you have a risky privacy strategy that you don't have a lot of controls over. You have a lot of data. You cannot get robust cyber insurance. You are at risk for a ransomware attack. The ransomware attackers somehow infiltrate your system. You're done as a business.
Yeah, that's a terrifying thought. I've never had any experience with ransomware, but I've always wondered, with that ransomware problem, I mean, this is where security and privacy start to blend into each other a little bit, because good security and good training of your people can help to mitigate ransomware. But if that happens and there is a ransomware attack, you now have a privacy problem, right? Because you had the duty to protect that data and you didn't do your job.
And I've always found it so interesting that companies always seem to have cyber security budgets. And I'm always like, but if you don't fully understand the landscape of your data and where it is, like, what are you protecting? So I've always found like they've kind of done it the opposite way. I'm like, have good controls over your data and data mapping. And then, yes, absolutely, security is very important. But you can't do security without privacy.
Yeah. So insurers will probably be doing more stuff around privacy in the future is one thought. And I think the other piece of startups and thinking about how we communicate and how people should start their privacy journey, one of the questions that I think is going to come up is, how do we get more people to care about this stuff? And I'll tell you, so when we started Osano, I didn't know at the beginning whether we would be a consumer product or whether we would be a product for businesses. And one of our investors in the very first round, before we had even a line of code written, he was like, I just don't think anybody cares. Now, he still did invest, which I was delighted about. But, that's been a refrain I've heard a number of times, is that, people don't care. They're just willing to give their data away. They don't care. Businesses don't care. Do you think that's the case? And if so, how do we change that?
I do think it's the case still. I hear it a lot. I do. Like, people will say, nobody cares about privacy. Nobody reads privacy policies. It's all about convenience. Until people are thrown in jail, like, nobody's actually going to do anything. In terms of what we do to change that, that's $1 million question. I've been working on it for 20 years. And I still feel like, for the most part, if you said to someone, do you care about your personal privacy? Most people would say, I don't know. Yes, maybe I do, but there's already so much data out there about me, and it's just so overwhelming. I don't even know what to do. And I think the concern that I have is, if you think about Cambridge Analytica, for example, they say that Cambridge Analytica was ultimately able to sway an election. Now, that's debatable. Like, there's people on both sides who will argue both sides of that. But we're able to do that with 5,000 pieces of data on each individual. They now say that by the time you are 18, 18 years old, there are 70,000 pieces of data on you floating throughout the web. Think about what could potentially be done with that data as you layer AI on. And so I sort of say to people, look, people will say, well, I don't use social media, et cetera. Well, your daughter does. And your daughter is 16 years old. And I'm telling you that we are going to likely have sophisticated enough algorithms that could probably predict whether or not your daughter will be rejected from college at the time she's 18 years old, because they've determined, based on her level of partying, her stomach will be pumped at the end of semester 1. So she's just going to be rejected. Now, do you care about privacy?
Yeah. I think kind of like we were talking about, I mean, everybody cares about privacy. They just don't know how to frame it. Just like everybody else, at midnight, sometimes I'm standing in front of the fridge, taking a drink out of the orange juice container when my wife wants me to put it in the cup. And, I'm looking around. I'm like, okay, honey, you're not looking. So I'll go ahead and drink out of that. But, we behave differently when we know that people are looking, or that there may be information about what we're doing that gets out. And if I had an inkling that the world would know that I drink orange juice out of the jar, I probably wouldn't do it. And I think everybody has that. And I wonder sometimes if privacy is one of those, and this is kind of a sad, dark thought, but I kind of sometimes wonder if privacy isn't one of those fundamental rights that people don't appreciate until it's taken away and it's too late, right? Because by the time we end up with a society like China, where every street corner has facial recognition and they're assessing credit scores based on the social good you've contributed, I don't know, that sounds pretty scary. And I think by the time you get there, it's too late.
I absolutely agree with you. But it's crazy to me in a way, because we can look back on what happened in Eastern Europe. It wasn't that long ago. We can look at China, but yet here in America, where we have incredibly bright minds and the ability to create really amazing technology, we still are sort of putting the profits over everything else. And data is very, very valuable.
I mean, that's where the saying, what was about 5-10 years ago, data is the new oil, was the phrase we kept hearing. And at the time, I thought it was probably right. But now looking back, it's like, oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, especially in the context of AI, that data that you have is valuable to somebody. Thank you for joining the podcast, because this is also an effort to educate and teach people about their rights and about how they should do things and why they should do things. And we've certainly taken the approach of try to convince businesses that becoming a trusted brand or remaining a trusted brand is going to be impacted by their privacy programs. We have gone a little bit over, and I am so grateful for you having come and spent the time with us for 2 episodes. Really do appreciate it. And, just as kind of a refresh, we talked about GDPR and how AI is going to impact privacy. We talked a little bit about some practical tips for how businesses should start in data privacy, and some doomsday predictions about how things are either going to go really, really well or really, really badly. Katharine, thanks for joining. It's a delight to have you on the show.
Thank you, Arlo. It's been so fantastic chatting with you about something that is very near and dear to my heart.
All right, folks. Well, if you haven't already, please pick up a copy of The Privacy Insider. You can find that on Amazon, both in hardback and in paperback. Make sure you listen to episode 1 if you haven't already listened to it. And tune in soon for our next episode of Privacy Insider, where we will talk about what's happening in the world of data privacy, why you should care, and how it might impact you. So have a wonderful day, and thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Privacy Insider podcast. You can find a full transcript of this episode and any show notes at osano.com. That's www.osano.com. And while you're there, get access to an excerpt of my book, The Privacy Insider: How to Embrace Data Privacy and Join the Next Wave of Trusted Brands, which is now available on Amazon for purchase. Until next month, take care. And remember, data privacy is a fundamental human right, y'all.